Part 1. The 12th of August, 1993. Spunk-munching dog-fucker! Greg said finally, clicking his fingers as he did. He was in the middle of explaining how he'd beat the Mountain King in a fight, and had abruptly paused to come up with what he called the perfect one-liner. After all, he explained, this'll be a momentous occasion in Duskbowl, and its new hero should mark it with the perfect finisher. Duskbowl has a way of shaping people. Marshall would come to know that better than most. To grow up here was to have every adult you know constantly tell you to be scared, be cautious, be safe. You were to do as you were told, and to see monsters in every shadow. Because one day, there may very well be. But Greg never seemed scared. Instead, the 12-year-old entertained Marshall with another make-believe battle with one of the town's big bads. Dumbass. Marshall laughed and rolled his eyes. You're just jealous because you couldn't beat him. Yeah, alright, diddy fuck, and you could. Greg assumed the humble brag expression. Why, of course I could. Sure, and how would you do that then? Greg made a gun with his fingers and pointed them at Marshall. I'd pull out a .44, aim for his head, and he made an explosion sound with his mouth. Like you could get your hands on a gun. Not to mention they don't even know how to use one. Haven't you heard? I've played Doom, so I'm basically a Navy SEAL. Marshall laughed again. Greg always had a direct line to his funny bone. A Navy SEAL? He was unconvinced. Yeah, one story I saw said that the game could be used to train Navy SEALs, and if the news said it, then it must be true. He said sarcastically. This coming from the guy that hasn't even finished it on Nightmare yet. And you have? Greg scoffed. Marshall shrugged and raised his hands. Hey, I'm not the one whose Navy SEAL training is being called into question. Greg slapped Marshall's arm playfully and turned back to the window. It was a long bus ride to school from the suburbs where the boys lived. But it was a drive they'd barely notice as they talked happily about nothing. The bus turned down a long stretch of road that ran alongside Lake Kingshot. Greg pressed his face against the vibrating glass and looked out over the eerie black water and stared into the looming mass of trees that was the Neverwood. A silence fell for a handful of minutes as Greg stared. A sort of soft seriousness grew. Are they really in there? Greg barely mumbled. Marshall, only half hearing him, looked up from the aglet he was fiddling with. What's up? What'd you say? The flowerboard people. Greg started, losing himself in the forest. Do you think they're really in there? What kind of a question was that? Of course they were. Right? It was a widely held belief in Duskbowl that all those who had vanished had either gone into or were taken into the Neverwood. But, like most beliefs, there was little in the way of evidence to back it up. Nevertheless, it was just an accepted fact. But why? Because the Lady of the Lake went on a rampage over a century ago? That wasn't good enough for Greg. There had to be something else at play. But Marshall wasn't so sure. I guess, Marshall responded finally. He wasn't sure how to answer that question. Forget about it, Greg sighed. Marshall felt a nagging feeling inside him. He thought it was stupid, but he felt like he had let Greg down in some way. He couldn't stand letting people down. Marshall and Greg didn't share any classes anymore. When together, the teachers had labelled them a disruptive influence, so they had been unceremoniously separated. Their parents argued it. Their mothers were friends, so the boys had been practically raised together. They were as thick as thieves, so trying to separate them was unforgivable. But hey, the teachers couldn't stop them from hanging out at lunch and recess. At least, that was their reasoning. This stupid arrangement upset Marshall at first. But now he had a new distraction. If the goal was to keep him focused in class, well, they'd have to get rid of her too. She sat 3 rows ahead of him. She had wavy brown hair, fair skin, and a giggle that made his heart flutter. He tried not to stare, but as often as he tried to look away, he'd find himself gazing longingly. And whenever he did, the whole 53-minute lesson would just slip by. He reckoned that new Radiohead song had to be about him. I'm a creep. Her name was Heather Peterson. And being too young to know better, he thought he loved her. Marshall was snapped out of his trance by the shrill ring of the bell for recess. He froze for a moment and looked to the clock that sat above the whiteboard as if to clarify the bell's claim. He gave a surprised grunt. Well, I'll be damned. He looked back to Heather, but she had already gathered her things and left as the bell had rung. So Marshall followed suit. He had to meet Greg anyway. Are you going to ask her out or not? Greg probed halfway through a cheeseburger that Marshall was sure he'd stolen from the canteen. I mean... He stopped to swallow a chunk of burger that he'd miscalculated the size of. If you like her, why not? A tiny smile crept onto Marshall's face, and Greg could see him redden. Yeah, I like her. You are adorable. Oh, fuck off. Marshall waved the joke away. I think I'll adopt you, Greg continued. Name me something cute like Daisy or Biscuit. Marshall just laughed him off, sat on a bench a ways away from the main thoroughfare to start eating his lunch. He opened his lunchbox to find an apple and a very, very sad-looking sandwich. The smell hit him like a truck. He grabbed the apple and left the sandwich. Oh, too much Vegemite. He was still getting used to making his own lunches. He missed when his mum would make them for him. But that was before that. He shook the thought away again. But seriously, why not ask her out? Greg sat down beside him and pulled out a neatly cut chicken sandwich. Is it because you don't want to commit to a girl who doesn't know how summer works? Dude, what? Yeah, man. You never noticed that she wears long sleeve crap all the time? Like, seriously, girl does not know what the term warm weather means. Or maybe she just got crazy eczema. Okay, dude, stop thinking so hard. You're gonna strain something. Marshall slapped his shoulder. Look, it's just... He searched for the words. I can talk to people just fine, but I think about talking to her and I choke up. Greg stared blankly for a moment. Dude, talking to girls is easy. It's just not talking to anyone else. Here, watch. Greg stood up and sauntered over to a group of girls that had huddled near the entrance to the school library. No, that's not... Marshall called after him. Greg hadn't understood what he meant, but was more than happy to just roll with his misconception. From where he sat, Marshall saw Greg effortlessly start talking with the girls. He looked calm, confident. He had no problems making friends. Never had. Marshall wished he could be like that. Not that he wasn't already, rather he just assumed that no matter what he did, Greg would just always be better than him. That's always the problem with idealizing a person. You stop seeing them for who they are, rather you see what you want to see. And in Marshall's case, he didn't see a boy whose low self-esteem left him happy to dive into any situation, because there'd be no reason to be scared of losing what you don't already have. No. Marshall saw the version of himself he wished he was. A cool, calm ladies' man. He studied Greg's body language, his mannerisms, all his little social cues. And the next time he went to talk to someone, Marshall would just be giving a 2-bit Greg impression. But where did this behaviour come from? It would have been far too easy to lay it at Duskbowl's feet. It was because of the tragedy that surrounds those who grew up here, or maybe it was the lingering fear of a knife-wielding crazy jumping out at you in the middle of the night. Or maybe the answer was much, much simpler. "I'm home!" Marshall called out as he swung open the door and kicked off his shoes. It had been a long, hot day, and 8 hours of sweat helped the polo shirt of his school uniform cling to his skin. Cold air hitting the wet patch on his back as he took off his school bag. No response. "Mom?" He slid his school bag into the corner next to another bag that his mother must have packed for him earlier that day. He saw it and felt himself deflate. Was it Friday already? Where had the week gone? He turned the corner into the kitchen and found his mother sat at the table, reading some rubbish romance novel. Ground control to Mum." She barely looked up from her book. "Oh, yes, dear. Good afternoon. How was your day?" It was a line. Marshall could have said anything. "Oh, yeah, Mum. Look, pretty shit. I had an orgy with some reptilian dinosaur women before taking the name of Christ in vain, and then, just to top things off, I ate a stale cheeseburger." She wouldn't have blinked. So, he didn't bother responding at all. And she didn't even try to follow up. Marshall found that, at a certain point in a kid's life, parents would become not uninterested in their child's lives, rather they'd become disinterested, neutral, completely impartial to the going-ons of their child's day-to-day. And not once did he ever consider that this was just his folks. No, he thought this was some widespread phenomenon. Perhaps that helped him cope. Marshall truly believed that his parents saw being a parent as a temporary state of affairs. He reckoned that the moment he became an adult, they'd drop this half-assed imitation altogether. But even still, Marshall couldn't help but hold out hope that things could go back to the way they were before. And maybe he could make that happen. He made a beeline for the kitchen sink and started washing up the small tower of dishes his mother had built up over the day. It had been like this ever since she started working from home. And Marshall, for some reason, believed that if he consistently made an effort to clean up after her, then maybe she'd give him more than a moment's notice. Notice me. Please, just notice me again. Your father will be here in a few hours. Make sure you're ready to go, she said, still not looking up from her book. As if double-checking, Marshall looked to the calendar that sat near the pantry. Friday. There was no doubt. Every fortnight he had to do this dance, and every fortnight he'd hate it more. It wasn't that he disliked his father, or even that he disliked staying with him for the weekend. The problem was that the same overwhelming disinterest had infected his father too. And above all else, It just made the breakup real again. Why couldn't things go back to the way they were before? Why the fuck did Mum and Dad have to screw everything up and break up? Sure, they didn't have a happy relationship. Any idiot could have seen that. But at least then, Marshall didn't feel like an unwanted dodgeball, being half-heartedly kicked between two disinterested parties. When they used to fight, he'd get upset. But in Marshall's mind, being unwanted, being unseen, was far worse. He balled his fists. He hated thinking about all this crap. He tried to suck in the tears. Failing that, he half ran to his room. He didn't want his mother to see him cry, or did he? Please, just notice me again. He whimpered as he shut the bedroom door behind him. I want my mum and dad back. The phrase made his skin crawl. Mum and dad. He could refer to them as singular, but putting them together in his mind like that now just felt so alien. So wrong. He reached under his bed and pulled out the walkie-talkie covered in at least 10 years' worth of shitty stickers. He pressed down on the action. Greg? Static. Greg, you there? He was just about to put the talkie away when it suddenly buzzed to life. Yo, what up? Marshall didn't know what to say. Why had he called him? Marshall? You gonna leave me on hold here or what? All of a sudden, an idea popped into Marshall's head. Something he'd never normally consider. Can I come over? It was a very spur-of-the-moment thing. Marshall knew that if he crept out of his window and made the trek to Greg's house, his father would be upset. He couldn't shake just how hurt that would make him feel. But at this point in time, it just seemed like the best thing for him to do. This place, this house felt suffocating. A reminder of the broken family he now found himself trapped in. He needed a breath. He needed out. At least, that's what he thought. After he got the go-ahead from Greg, Marshall threw on his thickest jacket and climbed out the window. He knew it was going to be a cold night. Bastard! He said to himself. What the hell kind of a son ditches his dad like that? Fuck, you're a piece of work. Why do you always have to be such a fucking pussy? Marshall held his arms close. It was bloody cold. But through the smog of self-loathing crap, something cut through all the voices in his head. Something made Marshall stop, dead in his tracks, and made him notice just how quiet the night was. He felt his skin twitch, and the fine hairs on his neck stand up. Fear. The most powerful emotion a person can feel. But fear of what? Was Marshall afraid of Duskbowl's crazies? Maybe one was going to jump out and gut him like a fish. No, something far worse had its eyes on him. Marshall didn't want to move. You know how it is when you're scared. Stupidly, you think that if you're still enough, whatever is after you will just not notice you anymore. In as little movement as possible, Marshall turned his head to see the monster. It was different on moonlit nights. The dense forest across the lake now looked like a great black mass in the dark, unable to be fully seen, but just visible enough that you know it's there. It's just a forest. It's just a forest, Marshall whispered. But the longer he stared at that simple forest, the more he felt that there was something in it. Looking back, a frozen silence fell. Nope! Marshall shook his head and ran the rest of the way to Greg's. If there was something in the Neverwood, there was no way in hell he was going to hang around to find out what. See? That's what I'm talking about. There's got to be something in there, dude. Come on, it'll be fun. Why did he tell Greg anything? Are you out of your fucking mind? Marshall wasn't even slightly supporting this harebrained idea. Pat, Greg's mother, leaned into the lounge room where the boys sat. Oi, if you're gonna swear, just make sure I can't hear it. Marshall giggled a little. Dude, your mum is awesome. Greg just rolled his eyes. Sorry, Auntie Pat, Marshall said. Does Susie know you're here? She called back. Nope. But would she even care? Yeah, Mama's all good with it, Marshall lied. He wished his mum was like Pat. She was funny and cool, and in his book, she was one of the few parents who didn't lose touch with what it was like to be a kid. Even when Marshall was in single digits, Pat had always held the title of coolest sort of aunt ever. But think about it. Greg jumped back in. If everyone from the flower board is in there, we can go and rescue them. And if they're not, well, we could stop the town from being so damn scared all the time. It was pointless. Marshall wouldn't budge. The Neverwood was Duskbowl's black hole, so there was no way he was going in there. But that wouldn't stop Greg from asking. Dude, please, I'll set up some gear for you and everything. I don't want to do this by myself. Marshall grew quiet, shook his head, and said no. The night went on, and the boys didn't discuss it again. Marshall's dad came and got him. Pat apologized profusely and scolded the boys. But before he left, Marshall turned to Greg and gave him a hug. An uncommon thing amongst 12-year-old boys, and both of them felt the cloud of awkwardness hanging over them. Marshall had no idea where the idea had come from, but it just seemed like the right thing to do. Still didn't stop him from staggering away awkwardly and giving him a haphazard punch to the shoulder. In some way, did he know what was coming? Or was it just a weird call of the void? As he and his father drove off, Marshall stared out of the window at the boy he'd grown up with. The boy that, for all intents and purposes, was his brother. And felt nothing but a strange wave of sadness. The night dragged on, and the people of Duskbowl went to bed as they had for years, with an uncertain, lingering dread. And while they slept, the Neverwood stood, watching the world with a silent hunger. The weekend came and went. Nothing of note happened between Marshall and his father. It was just more of the unbearable silence and unfamiliarity that Marshall had grown so used to. He was starting to wish that he'd stayed at his mother's. At least then he'd have access to the walkie-talkie and could talk to Greg. He couldn't wait for Monday. But what did Monday bring? When Marshall got to school, he was surprised to find police there waiting for him. His father half protested, but a constable took him aside and whispered something to him. His father's face turned from angry to worried, and then he backed away, colour drained. 2 constables turned Marshall away from school and walked him to their cruiser. Marshall's eyes darted about, half sentences falling from his mouth, panicked questions as the boy tried to understand what was going on as they pushed him into the car. He looked out the window to see his father watching on lamely. Why was he just letting this happen? Marshall had seen cop movies before. They weren't supposed to do this. Why wasn't his dad doing anything? In the many watching, gossiping faces of his peers that watched from the school gates, Marshall saw Heather. Please don't judge me for this, he thought. When the cruiser pulled up to the station and Marshall was pulled out, he saw Pat, and a wave of relief washed over him. Marshall, wanting nothing than to leave this whole situation behind, willing to give anything for comfort, as he fought the childish need to cry. He ran to her, but when he was in range, she snatched him with both hands, shook him violently. He looked at her, confused and scared. "You little bastard!" she screamed. Two officers came up from behind her and pulled her away from the boy. "What did you do? What did you do?" Her voice got quieter and quieter as she was dragged away, but she never stopped screaming the question. What the fuck was happening? Marshall was left in an interrogation room, his small wrists cuffed to the table. Had he done something wrong? What was happening? He just needed a moment to try and gather himself, to collect his thoughts. He thought about trying to sing an AC/DC song he half remembered under his breath. Focusing on the words takes your mind away from the problem, he reasoned. He was sure that was why soldiers used marching songs. It was something, so he tried it. The door creaked open, and in came the sheriff with a young man tailing behind him. Everyone knew about the sheriff in Duskbowl. Marshall was relieved when he saw it was him. Any kind face would do at this point. The man had a reputation for being kind and trustworthy, a thorough cop who always sought out the truth. Marshall hoped that was true. He wanted answers. "Okay, son," the sheriff started, stroking his white beard and adjusting his reading glasses. He pulled out a series of documents and lifted a small snap-lock bag onto the table. "My name is Sheriff Woods, and this gentleman is..." He seemed as though he was straining to remember the name of the man that sat beside him. "This gentleman is Cole Bradshaw. We just wanted to ask you a few questions about your friend Gregory." "Greg," Marshall shyly corrected. Woods smiled. He had a kindly warmth to his wrinkled face. That, and his gravelly voice, reminded Marshall of the voices on the old book tapes his dad used to listen to. "Sorry about that, son. We'd like to ask you some questions about Greg." Bradshaw scoffed and rolled his eyes, clearly making a mockery of the sheriff's attempt to comfort the boy. The sheriff cocked his head towards him and whispered harshly, but silently, so the marshal didn't hear. "Don't push it, Jimmy." Bradshaw rolled his eyes again and folded his arms. Woods didn't want Marshall to hear that, so Marshall pretended he didn't. But he did look over Bradshaw. He wasn't in a police uniform. Who was this guy? Was he a cop? A lawyer, perhaps? Woods caught Marshall's lingering eyes and dismissed their questions. "I'm just showing him the ropes before..." He stopped himself. Honest men always reveal too much. He pulled himself back to the subject at hand. "Son, we're very worried about Greg. And I know that you're not a dumb little kid, so I was hoping you could tell me where he is." Marshall stared dumbly. I don't know what you're talking about." Years of cop movies had told him that all that would do is make him seem more suspicious. But what else was he going to say? He genuinely had no idea what the old man was on about. "Playing stupid ain't gonna help you, kid," Bradshaw cooed. Woods shot him another glare. He sighed and removed the contents of the snap-lock bag. A piece of paper and a flashlight. "To Marshall." He started reading the note aloud. "We're going whether you want to or not. I would have gotten you an explorer's pack, but this flashlight will have to do. Greg. Woods slid the paper back into the bag and stared, looking like he was waiting for Marshall to say something. Marshall wanted to punch Greg in the head. He even went to stomp under the table out of frustration. The idiot has gone into the Neverwood, sir. He wanted me to go with him. Wood's demeanor changed in a flash. He leaned away from Marshall, and his face grew cold, unapologetic. Bradshaw, on the other hand, did as he was told, and said nothing. But he did light up a cigarette. Don't lie to me, son. You don't want to know how much trouble you could get into, Woods said. Confusion was written all over Marshall's face. He was at a loss for words. What else was he supposed to say now? That was the truth. You expect me to believe that a young boy like Greg was actually willing to go into the Neverwood, volunteered to do it? I don't know what you want to hear, sir. That's what's happened. I mean, people go in there all the time, right? What about the NE? Woods reached out and placed a hand on the back of Marshall's palm. Marshall saw that kindness come back to Woods' eyes. You're only a boy. Please, leave this alone, he begged. Begged? What was going on? Oh, you gotta be fucking kidding me. Bradshaw laughed. He stood up and left the room, leaving behind a small cloud of smoke. But Wood's hand stayed on Marshall's. Please, son. Drop it. You think you're somewhere else, he told him. This situation was bigger than Marshall. He didn't know how to take it. He was only a kid, for Christ's sake. He wanted to make the sheriff happy, but he was always told that honesty was your best friend. And it felt like the sheriff was telling him to lie. But he had no idea why. Not sure of what he was doing, Marshall repeated. He's in the Neverwood. The sheriff lowered his gaze and drew his hand back. He pushed himself up from the table and went for the door. Listen, kid. I'll do what I can for you, but please don't fight it. It won't be pretty. But please don't fight it. Marshall was alone in the interrogation room. He finally got that moment to collect his thoughts. That afternoon, Sheriff Woods would hold a press conference in which he explained that Marshall had only said that he knew that Greg had left, but he didn't know where or why. The boy knows nothing. The sheriff stressed that point. What was it, a mercy perhaps? But a mercy Marshall wouldn't understand for a very long time. Two trains of thought began to circulate around the boy as time went on. There was the sheriff's story and Pat's story. Greg's mother was the only other person that ever saw the note, and with it now being in an evidence lockup, she didn't really have any access to it anymore. Nevertheless, she'd paraphrase it to anyone that would listen. The short version of her story? My son is missing, and Marshall knows where he is. Part 2. It wasn't pity that drove her to him. It was empathy. Heather knew what it was like to be truly alone. Though she'd never admit it, she probably knew better than Marshall would ever hope to. Fear was a core part of who Heather was. She wished she wasn't so afraid so often, but something far worse than a town had shaped her. Even so, she wanted to throw the boy some sort of lifeline. She knew he watched her in class sometimes. She didn't find it flattering, but she didn't hold it against him. She had learned to be hyper-aware for other reasons. Reasons that would have been unfair to hold Marshall accountable for. But a life rope wasn't going to be easily given, as just walking up to him and striking up a conversation wasn't really on the table. Teachers and parents urged children to stay away from him en masse. After all, if you give a scared, paranoid mob a scapegoat, you can bet your ass they'll take it, young boy or not. So she came up with a plan. Every recess and lunch, Marshall sat in the same spot by the canteen. If she got there first, she could leave her care package. A simple book. The same book that helped her escape from her father for just a few hours at a time. The Fellowship of the Ring. On the cover, she left a sticky note that said, "Read me." And just inside the first page, she left a folded note that said, "I know you don't know me. And I hope this doesn't come off as weird or anything, but I just want you to know that not everyone here hates you. I can tell you from experience that it gets easier. Please, never give up on yourself. I hope this book helps you the way it helped me. Heather." Marshall looked up and around as he finished the note, his face clearly red. Heather blushed a little at that. But she didn't expect anything else to come from this. She had done a nice thing, and that would be that. But the next day, she felt the need to go and watch him at recess again. She thought it was only fair, being that she knew that he still watched her in class. But he wasn't there, which was strange because she knew he was at school today. Instead, where he would normally sit, there was a book. Heather's heart sank. It was understandable. She had seen how others would throw things at Marshall, how the canteen ladies would spit in his food. It made sense that he would be slow to trust. Regardless, Heather didn't want to see her favourite book sitting out getting sun-bleached. She raced out and plucked it up in a single motion, not stopping to inspect the cover for damage. But once she did, she found something she wasn't expecting. This wasn't her book. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? She read aloud, tracing her fingers along the slightly raised cover. She'd never even heard of this before. Had some kid left it? Or was it Marshall's? Inside the cover, she found a folded note, similar to the one that she had left, but this one was in far messier handwriting. It read, "Heather, thank you for the book. It really means a lot. I'm not going to lie, I expected there to be a catch. I hope this is a good enough repayment. I don't read very much, but this book was always one that I liked. I hope you like it too. Marshall." Heather barely noticed her toothy grin. And for months, this is how these two socially inept loners communicated, passing notes at drop-off points like they were in some backwards concentration camp. It was ridiculous. Over time, they learned to have a few selected drop-off points. It was Heather's idea. Leaving a random book at the same spot every day was surely going to gain some level of suspicion. She wished that they could just find a quiet spot for just the two of them and talk. But it couldn't be in this place. It was far too risky. "I saw Mrs. McCannon throw an apple at you the other day. Are you all right?" Heather wrote. "Also, thank you for the new book. I can tell it's new, you dork. You'd never read this. It's okay. What about you? I didn't see you in roll call. Where were you today? I had to stay home for a bit to help my dad with something." Marshall wanted to ask her about her dad, but it was a subject that she always danced around. But by the same token, Heather had always wanted to ask him about Greg. She had so many questions, but in the end, neither of them were forthcoming. It seemed it would become a waiting game. Who'd be the first to ask the right question? To ask at the right time? Who would be the first to draw? Heather, apparently. She took great care when she wrote that night. Constantly writing and erasing, trying to find the best way of approaching the question. But at the end of the day, how do you ask someone a question like that without being straight up? So, as much as it made her cringe and as much as she thought it was tactless, that's what she did and hoped for the best. So, the note began, neatly written as ever. I don't really know how to ask this, but I'd like to know. If you don't want to tell me, that's fine, I understand, and please don't hold it against me. Here goes. What happened to Greg? It took Marshall far longer to reply than normal, at least 2 days. When Heather watched him from afar read the note, he seemed upset. He threw himself up from the bench, stuffed the note into his pocket, and hurried away. She kicked herself for days. Idiot! 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 She said to herself. She just couldn't leave well enough alone. She didn't want to scare Marshall away. All she really had was him. Well, him and... She wouldn't let herself think about her dad. She tried to shake him from her head. She never knew how far he'd go. God help her if he knew she was writing notes to Marshall. But one day, a note came. He left. Went into the Neverwood. Why? Because of course he fucking did. And no one believes me that he did. Even the sheriff told me to drop it when I brought this up with him. I didn't kill him, and I'm not keeping his location a secret. I don't know where he is. I don't know why he'd do this to me. Heather felt like she was going to jump when she got Marshall's note. Relief. But the joy quickly fell away as she read it. Why would the sheriff tell you to drop it? He's a good man. Well, at least that's what everyone says. Maybe you should try talking to him about it again. Marshall tried not to, but he felt like he was on trial. He had become so defensive on this topic. Still, he knew Heather was a friend. He tried to temper himself. There's no point. Trust me. I just want everyone to be happy again. I just want Greg to come back. Then all this shit can be over. I mean, why don't you look for him? Heather knew that was a stupid thing to ask the moment she wrote it down, but she still sent it, knowing full well what the answer would be. I'm too scared. Marshall saw no point in being dishonest. The idea of going to the Neverwood still terrified him, but that didn't mean that the thought hadn't crossed his mind. Greg was like a brother. Marshall wasn't willing to just abandon him. There had been several nights where he'd packed his bags, climbed out his window, and marched to the Neverwood. But he was a coward. With every step he made towards the Neverwood, at a point, the fear would feel like it was strangling him, a truly unbearable terror. So every time he tried to go into those woods, he'd run away. Marshall would never know that the Neverwood didn't want him to enter. Not just yet. Then maybe try talking to the police again? But not the sheriff. What about that other guy that follows him around? Heather was grasping at straws. Marshall strained to remember the man's name. What? Bradshaw? I don't know, dude. That guy seems... Well, he seems like an asshole. Heather nodded. She'd never spoken to the man, but she tried to hold out hope for Marshall's sake. It's worth a shot, right? How bad could he be? Marshall still dismissed it. He didn't trust that guy as far as he could throw him. Didn't even seem like Woods trusted him either. No, the answer was as clear as it ever was. Marshall knew he'd have to go into the Neverwood at some point, but he just needed the right push. Part 3. Marshall was a young man now. The senior years of high school seemed to creep up on him. It seemed like only days prior he'd left primary school. He lived on his own now. barely making by in a shitty little apartment on Duskbowl's northwest side. After years of questioning and accusations, his parents' disinterest turned to hate. His mother was quick to jump to Pat's side. They had been friends long before Marshall was born, so his mother easily picked her over him. And his father? Well, he just left. One night, he got in his car and was never seen again. Marshall was working part-time at Duskbowl FM. Just studio stuff, anything really to make money. It wasn't exactly his dream job, but he did sometimes think that maybe he could make Duskbowl happier if he got on the air. Maybe they'd give him a second chance. Maybe. As the years had ticked by, the town's hate for Marshall had died down somewhat, but there was still lingering negativity. After all, the town was full of people, and people do grow. Maybe not fast, and maybe not kindly, but they do develop and change. Balancing work with school was hard, and whilst his grades were never anything to write home about before, they had really taken a dive after he started working. But he reasoned that it was a necessary evil in order to keep his little slice of paradise, a joke name he'd given to his apartment. He looked around at the dingy walls as he sat in his musty brown chair. Most in his situation would dream of getting out, leaving Duskbowl far behind. But Marshall was a sedentary person. He had no intention of ever leaving Duskbowl. His aspirations never extended farther than its borders. He just wished Duskbowl was better, whatever that meant. It was an empty dream, he told himself, without ever really thinking of how to achieve it. He looked at the digital clock that sat atop his Magnavox CRT. It read 7:30 p.m. She was late. Maybe she got held up at school, or maybe she had to take care of her dad again. Heather and Marshall never stopped writing to each other, and, thankfully, her dad never found out about it. And as the years went by, she became Marshall's sole ray of light. Now a young man, he was sure of it. He loved her. And, as if life had decided to be kind to him just this once, she loved him too. But he never considered just how much he meant to her. Fundamentally, first loves are like PE staff rooms, full of fuck-ups. Members of first loves never know what it is to really be in a relationship. They don't understand the ebb and flow of romance. Thus, they're doomed to fail. But again, Marshall was naive of this. He looked to the old mattress that sat in the corner of his room. God, he wished he'd thrown it out. He wanted his first time with Heather to be romantic and wonderful, special, just like in the movies. Instead, that sad excuse of a bed got the honor of hosting their first session. Speaking of, he looked back to the clock. She really was late, by at least an hour. He was worried, but there wasn't much he could do. He didn't have her phone number, and that was her idea, in case her dad ever picked up the phone. So, he waited. And waited. The knock on the front door startled him awake. He choked on his own snoring, and wiped the drool from the corner of his mouth. The clock now read 10:17 a.m. He shrugged. Didn't realize he was that tired. He tried to straighten himself up for Heather. She'd always ask him to take better care of himself, but his self-esteem wasn't exactly accommodating of that subjective. Ah, God, sorry I look like shit. Where were you last night? He asked groggily as he opened the door, the late morning sun kicking him in the face. He winced. Bradshaw, now with the badge of sheriff pinned to his shirt, said with a smile, "Oh, you know, sweetheart, hanging out with the girls." Marshall missed Sheriff Woods. But the old man hadn't been seen in years now. "What do you want, Bradshaw?" The sheriff took off his hat and placed it against his chest. "Well, I'm afraid we got some bad news." Bradshaw told him everything. Heather's father had reported her missing that morning. She hadn't been seen and couldn't be found anywhere. You didn't kill her by chance, did you? Bradshaw mocked. As far as he knew, no one knew about him and Heather. So had Bradshaw just come over to mock him? Or poke fun at the tired old wound that Greg had left behind? Or did Bradshaw know more than he was letting on? Marshall didn't bother answering, and shut the door in his face. Bradshaw stood there for a second, clearly toying with the idea of pushing Marshall further, but took a breath, showed restraint, laughed to himself, and left. Marshall's thoughts became singular. After all these years, he knew what he had to do. What he always had to do. And now, he had his push. Because that's where the vanished people go. That's where the vanished people are taken. He threw together what supplies he could and made his way to the silent wooded beast beyond Lake Kingshot. He couldn't help but let his mind wander as he made his way. Maybe he might find something about Greg too. Maybe he could finally make everyone happy. And maybe, if they were happy, Duskbowl would be better. This town needed at least one person to come back from the black hole that was the Neverwood. Maybe then they could heal. He stood at the threshold, thankful that they didn't put up Bradshaw's proposed barricades yet. But that didn't mean the cops weren't watching, hence why he went at night. The childish fear still sat inside him, but he could control it now. Being older meant he could tell himself that it was just a forest, and now he'd half believe it. He never thought that this time the Neverwood had permitted his entrance. This was it. All those stories, all those years of fighting off Greg's musings of what it would be like, and yet here he was. The Neverwood. At random, he picked a direction and started his search. Clumsy and loud, he cried out her name, "Heather!" He screamed until it felt like his vocal cords would tear. He kicked up leaves and looked in hollows. "Please!" And years of being called murderer, and a life of missing Greg. Hope was quickly dying inside of Marshall. Where once there was a feeling like fire inside his chest, now all that there was a pit of hopeless denial. He fell to his knees, arms limp. "Please don't be gone too. I don't want to be alone." The soundless depths of the Neverwood set in. It was only now that he truly recognized where he was. He didn't cry, didn't even scream. What would be the point? Sometimes it's easier just to let the sea take you. He thought that this must have been what true defeat felt like. But something was watching him lose. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the rough shape of a person. He turned. Nothing. He shook his head. What was left to do? Trembling, he stood and continued on, aimlessly. Or so he thought. Something else had predetermined his path, though he didn't know it. Marshall was being led to his gift. How long had it been? He didn't know anymore. Long enough for his feet to start blistering. He thought that he probably should have brought some actual hiking shoes. Oh well. Suddenly, he felt compelled to stop in front of a large, unassuming tree. Confused, he stared. Why had he stopped? Looking over the trunk and gazing up to the foliage, the tree seemed utterly unremarkable. But then he saw it. Almost completely hidden under thick moss and shrub, lying against the tree was the unmistakable shape of a body. Marshall yelped, fell, and shuffled away on his hands until his back hit the opposing tree. He stared straight at the body, not sure whether to scream or run. It was skeletal, the flesh long gone. Both arms seemed to hang in front of its torso, still attached to hands that were snagged in between the ribs by its fingers. Marshall followed the column-like bloody tears in the small body's shirt that seemed to trail behind the fingers. It appeared that this person had clawed themselves to death. He gagged, hard, barely holding back the spew. This person had clawed themselves to death. What the fuck? Stupidly, he looked around for some non-existent help. Then, he looked back to the body, seeing it all. The clawing tears, the small moss-covered frame, and the school bag. The school bag? It all clicked. Horrified and heartbroken, Marshall went to reach out a hand but stopped himself. Greg? He cringed, not wanting to believe it. Closure. Horrible and unforgiving as it was, that was all he could think of it now. Closure. He could tell Pat where her son was, and maybe he could finally clear his name. But most important of all, he'd found his friend. He slumped. Hey, bro. He checked back tears. I finally came in. Just like you wanted me to. I missed you. You fucking bastard. But enough of that. It's time to get you home. Marshall, gently and softly, went to collect the bones, but stopped suddenly. A horrible thought had climbed into his head, and as much as he tried to push it away, bury it, it persisted. Fuck! He spat, tears streaming. It's not fair! He whimpered. He had to pull himself away from Greg. He sat back against the opposite tree. If I take you home, they'll put me away. They'll be convinced that I did this to you. They won't believe my side. Why the fuck would they? They never do. No one ever does. He punched the ground next to him over and over until his knuckles stung and bled. With angry tears he hissed, But I just want to get you out of here. His voice cracked as he cried, Damn it! Greg and Marshall stared at each other for hours, saying nothing. The impossible choice made Marshall weep until there were no tears left to cry. Finally, he stood and said, You will always be my brother. He wanted to say something else, but held it back. He turned, wiped away his tears, and continued on, leaving Greg behind, cold and alone. Heather was still gone, but she wasn't his to find. No matter how hard he looked, no matter what direction he picked, no matter how long he walked, he'd always find himself at the forest's exit, looking out over Lake Kingshot. The Neverwood had shown him what it wanted, and now it was time to leave. He couldn't find Heather, and he had to abandon Greg, the two people he cared about most. He left a broken, guilt-stricken man. But he swore to try and live the life Greg couldn't, to try and be the man he knew he wasn't, but the person who Greg wanted to be. Duskbowl has a way of shaping people, but Greg wanted to be the one that shaped it into something better. So, for him, Marshall would try to realize the young boy's dream. But was this born from honor or guilt? A grown man living out a child's fantasies, even against his own best interests. And what of the Neverwood? Marshall would never return. At least, not until it wanted him to. So it stood, tucked away in a cold little spot, silent and waiting. All part of the plan.
She watches from the water, little boys and girls she takes. She'll creep into your room at night. The Lady of the Lake. Duskbowl's boogeyman seemed to be where I'd find answers. After all, the only clue I had was scrawled on a newspaper about her. I needed more information on her, and that wasn't going to be a cakewalk. I didn't feel safe just strolling down the street and asking people. For one, the sheriff's department might still be looking for me, and not to mention that thing was still out there. No, I'll need to be clever about this. I reasoned that the town library might have something on the Lady of the Lake. You know, archived newspapers and, I can only assume that is where Jamie got her clipping. But I couldn't just stroll in. But at the same time, I wasn't too keen on breaking into another place. I must have looked like a right creep, my hood up over my head and sulking around the library. But hey, if looking like a Wes Craven villain was what I needed to do to get my answers, I'd be willing to dress up as Freddy Krueger. I was waiting for a kid to walk past. I only had a 50 in my wallet, but I'm sure any kid worth their weight would be willing to do something as simple as print stuff for a 50. But I had my reservations. That was a lot of money. All I had left in my name, in fact. I thought about breaking it for a 20, but I couldn't risk the kid turning their nose up. I was loitering there for a good few hours, making sure to keep my face hidden whenever I saw a cop car drive past. I didn't know if they were specifically looking for me, but I couldn't be too sure. Eventually, this school bully-looking kid rode past on his scooter. Not the best choice. He looked like the kind of boy that would have bullied me in high school. Oh well, better than nothing. Hey, kid. I ushered him over, but kept my voice low. He was really standoffish at first. Understandable, I guess. Must have looked like a pedo the way I was standing. No, it's alright. I don't want to hurt you. I just need you to do me a favor.
Oh yeah? Like what?
The kid was making sure to keep his distance. That was alright. I didn't need him to think I was a saint. I pointed to the library. You see that building over there? I want you to go in and print off anything and everything you can find on the Lady of the Lake. The boy made a puzzled face.
The ghost story? What's in it for me?
Ghost story? Did this kid not know that the king shot killings really happened? I chuckled a little at that. I pulled out the 50 and waved it in front of him. All this is yours if you do this teeny tiny thing. Come on, for you it's a win! The kid thought for a moment.
Alright, you got a deal. Creep.
He got back on his scooter and rode the short distance to the glass sliding door. I watched him until he disappeared inside. And now we wait. The kid was in there for a fair while, but I couldn't afford the risk of going to the library and checking on him. All I could do was wait. I let my eyes wander. You know, as you do when you're bored. I've never been the most patient person. There wasn't a whole lot to look at. This was Duskbowl, after all. Some guy walking his dog, lady on her phone. Just everyday people. But then I felt that hum in my head again, and caught a glimpse of an eye person standing across the road from me. It was in broad daylight, and it was just staring at me. I could feel my fingers locking up again as my head began to fill with that god-awful hum. Jesus, it was staring at me. Why was it staring at me? Why wasn't anyone else looking at it? Suddenly, I felt a hard yank on my arm that tore my gaze away from the thing.
I said, here's your stupid Lady of the Lake stuff, miss.
The kid was clearly annoyed. How long had he been trying to get my attention? Thanks, kid. Here you go. I was stumbling over my words and my hands were trembling as I held out the note. It felt like my brain was rebooting. I had learned from last time I wasn't going to look back at the creature. The kid dropped the large pile of documents at my feet and snatched the money out of my hand. I looked as my dinner for the next few nights rode away. I picked up the documents and staggered away. Once I got somewhere safe, I sat down and began poring over the documents. The top pile was a lot of useless rubbish. Common spooky stories about her, pages of rhymes, etc. Just horror movie crap. I reckon I audibly sighed when I saw Spooky Tales from Duskbowl on one of the pages. I had to expect this, though. I hadn't exactly given that poor kid any real direction. I basically made him Google Darth Vader and print out every result. But once I got through the bullshit, that's when things became interesting. There were newspaper clippings, very old accounts, everything. How the hell did he get this stuff? No matter. I had it now, and that was all that mattered. I took particular notice of one clipping in particular. It was a front page story. Most of the information was blacked out because, of course, it was. But underneath the grainy black and white picture of Lake Kingshot, one word. A word I'd seen before. Campanist. Campanist, I said under my breath. What was that? Now I wish I had another 50 so that I could get some kid to look up the word. Oh well, I had to work with what I knew. Obviously, campanist was important, and clearly it was in some way related to Lake Kingshot, but that lake backs onto the Neverwood. And I'll be damned if I went in there alone. I needed someone who knew what they were doing. Then I remembered. The Neverwood Exploration Club. I opened Marshall's journal and flipped through the pages until I found where he mentioned the NEC. They used to meet up at Garrett Hall, but the sheriff's department kept arresting them. Why? It seemed that Garrett Hall was my next port of call. But before I closed the journal, I found myself poring over the words. Marshall really did have a way of sounding like a show pony. I know I teared up in that moment, but I couldn't help but chuckle. I never had many friends. Hell, even when I got my first job at Duskbowl FM, nobody there even acknowledged my existence. But Marshall did. He'd hang out with me. He'd play games with me. We talked about movies, music, you name it. When he wasn't on air, he was really kind. I was trying to run away from my problems when I moved to Duskbowl, but I really didn't consider the possibility of ending up with someone who actually liked me here. I stared at the journal, tears still welling. "I'll find you," I whispered.
Part 1. The 18th of September, 2003. Ash hadn't prepared for her arrival in Duskbowl. Even with her blue hoodie pulled up, the night air was sharp and cut through to her goosebumped skin. I can still go home, she thought. Ash looked back down the road she had come. I can wait for a bus to Sampsonshire and I can go home. It was a moonless night, and a sheet of blackness hung over the road after only a few meters. The streetlight above her, as good at brightening the area as a paraplegic is at running a marathon. No. She hugged herself tightly. You'll be okay, Ashley. It's okay. She consoled herself in the same way that she had seen him do hundreds of times. Ash felt her eyes burn, and a feeling like a hot ball slid up her throat and sat in her mouth. The need to cry again was unbearable. Her eyes were still dry, and her throat raw after the bus ride. God, not again, she said. She slapped herself, trying to emphasize the point. You don't get to cry, you bitch, cow, monster. She wanted to call herself every name under the sun. If she could, she would have bashed the living daylights out of herself. But she couldn't. Ash knew what he would think. She cupped her face and cried out, Okay. You're alright, Ashley. You're alright. Ash spent that night in an alley near the bus stop. She had barely enough money for food, let alone a hotel room. Sure, she could drop her $200 on one night at a hotel, but then she'd be out the next day and somehow more broke than when she started. No, there had to be a workaround. The next morning, Ash went looking for cars on the side of the road. It is a universal law that every town on Earth has at least one road where single parents sold their paddock bashers and rust buckets. She just hoped that they wouldn't ask her for any paperwork. There was a hazy fog that morning, and somehow that made Ash feel colder. But of course, the condensation that had seeped into her socks wasn't doing her any favours either. She looked to the sun, hardly squinting thanks to the fog. Hey, would you mind putting the heater on, pal? Some of us have to work here. She pinched the bridge of her nose. By midday, she had found her rust bucket, an old Ford Laser. Its owner, a heavily overweight woman with blue hair and glasses, scowled at her. Boyfriend kick you out, Dal? She said, pong of fake fruit from her chewing gum making Ash's eyes water. Ash turned away, trying to avoid the woman's blitzkrieg breath. Yeah, sure. It was easier to roll with the woman's assumptions than to tell the truth. She rolled her eyes. Men, she croaked. All right, Dal. The belt doesn't work, the wheel rims are warped, the exhaust system's rusted to shit, and the radio only takes tape. Ash stared. She's dead, Dal. She's all yours, but call a mechanic or RACT or someone. Otherwise, she's not going anywhere. Does the heater work? The woman spat out her gum, reached into the driver's side window, and ripped off the vent cover for the heater. The cover seemingly fused shut. She tossed it over her shoulder towards the road. Works now. Okay, thanks. Awesome. Ash said meekly. The woman pushed the sweaty car keys into Ash's hand. Pleasure doing business with you. As the woman waddled away, Ash saw a driver on the road slow down and yell, Oi, Natasha! Quit flinging shit on the road, you idiot! Ah, fuck off, you sexist dog! She spat back. Their spat growing quieter as they got farther and farther away. Ash slid into the front seat and turned on the heater. She felt like she could get tetanus just from sitting there, but at least now she was warm. She cranked the chair back and shut her eyes, hoping that she wouldn't get moved on by a cop. Oh, maybe they don't care about car sleepers here? Ash kicked off her shoes and draped her wet socks over one of the heaters. Just a quick nap, she said. Just a quick nap. With her 5-star lodging sorted, Ash had to get her financial situation figured out. Her lovely little rust bucket had taken all the money she had. So, later that afternoon, she found herself at the one place she was remotely qualified to work at. Duskbowl FM. She read the cheap neon sign out front. She hesitated before entering the station. The events of that night back in Sampsonshire still pressing down on her. God, sack up, Ashley. You've got no choice this time. What is this? Mark, the man interviewing her, held up her hastily scribbled resume. At this point, it was less of a job interview and more like a cry for help. Ash smiled politely and swept some of her hair behind her ear. Mark looked tired, annoyed, and bored all at once. The middle-aged man wondered how he had gone from wanting to become a writer fresh out of high school and instead ending up in this dead-end dump. He licked his lips, thinking about the scotch he kept in his desk drawer. He looked back to the resume. Says here you've got experience in radio. Is that true? Yep. Well, sort of. Ash trailed off. So I take it then you'll have no trouble telling me what an XLR cable is used for then. Ash smiled, trying hopelessly to hide the cogs turning in her head at top speed. Just say something, she thought. Yeah, XLRs are used to connect the big antenna on the roof to the rest of the station. Right? Did you really just put that as a question? She thought. Mark leaned back in his chair, spine making an audible crack. He scrunched up Ash's resume and tossed it into the rubbish bin. He looked over the young woman before him, small, visibly tired, and wearing a friggin' hoodie to a job interview. Any self-respecting employer would throw her out in her ass faster than you could say Han shot first. Lucky for Ash, Mark's self-respect was somewhere in a high school car park. That and Duskbowl FM hadn't had a new hire in at least 2 years. They weren't exactly loved by the community. All right. You start next Monday. Try and clean yourself up between now and then. He reached under the table and pulled out a stack of dusty books. He pointed to each. On-air protocol, equipment instructions, and recording and maintenance 101. Between now and Monday, these are your Bible. Ash stood and extended a hand. Thank you for giving me this chance. I'll do my best. Whatever. Mark walked back to his office, shut the door, and pulled out his beloved scotch. That weekend, Ash sat up all night in her rust bucket, holding the pages of her books to the window, using the moon as her reading light. The chair's springs attacking her, the book's pages giving her paper cuts, and her general exhaustion were all sure to pay off by Monday. And Ash was confident in saying that by the time Monday had come, she had no fucking idea what she was doing. She rubbed her head. Oh, fuck me. The studio at Duskbowl FM was divided into 2 rooms. One, where the announcer sat with some rudimentary equipment, and the other, where the real magic happened, was a dark, windowless hive of dials, buttons, and blinking lights. And that was where Ash found herself. She looked through to the announcer's booth, part of her still wishing that she was in there. Maybe one day. But no, it's too soon, she whispered. The door to the announcer's booth swung open, and in came a young man with dirty blonde hair. He fell into his chair and started fiddling with some of the dials on his side. He pressed a button, and a speaker next to Ash's ear sprung to life. "G'day, Jeremy. Let's keep the game consistent today, alright? Don't want to blow out some poor old woman's hearing aid." The image of that made Ash think of Faulty Towers, and she smiled. "Oh, and, about what you and the guys were saying," he started. The man looked to the tinted screen between the 2 rooms. Ash, thankful he couldn't see her. But she did wonder. Maybe I should tell him I'm the new girl. His friend isn't here. The man looked defeated for just a second. For the smallest moment, Ash could see a plea in his eyes. "Don't worry about it." He shaped back up. He pressed another button, and the words "on air" clicked on in red neon above Ash's head. "Good morrow, madams and misters, brothers and sisters." The broadcast went by with barely a hitch, all things considered. Yes, Ash spent most of it frantically flipping through her guidebooks, only just keeping this proverbial ship from sinking. But at the end of the day, they had not sunk. So that was an overall win. Ash crept outside to eat her lunch, if you could even call it that. Maybe in some alternate dimension, this sad, deflated thing in her hands could be considered a sandwich. "That wasn't so bad, right?" she thought. "Yeah, I did good." She cringed. She didn't deserve compliments. She kicked herself. "Allison, right?" The young man from before had appeared next to her, trying his best friendly smile. Ash was both scared and confused. Had he meant to talk to someone else, but had her mistaken? And if he did mean to talk to her, how the hell was that supposed to work? She hadn't had time to prepare a conversation script for herself. She brought her knees to her chest and nibbled her sandwich. The young man sat beside her. "Well, I'm Marshall anyway." No response. The inside of Ash's head had moved to DEFCON 3. Martial law declared, emergency, human interaction has been initiated. You did a good job today. And between us, it's always cool to see a new face in town. Ugh, last time that happened was... He pretended to think hard and put on his best scholar voice. "Why, the last time we had a newcomer around these parts was in the summer of 1721. But When he brought with him the horrors of the New World, well, we chased him out of town. Marshall laughed at his own joke. Ashley. What? Marshall's ears pricked up, Ash suddenly joining the conversation. My name is Ashley. Marshall laughed and sighed. Well, Ash, looks like Mark went and fucked up your name on the work roster then. That is going to cause some bookkeeping problems down the line, let me tell you. That sounded about right. You know, Ash didn't think she'd ever made a good first impression on anyone. So why would Mark even bother remembering her name? People just didn't want to be friends with her. But of course, like most introverts, Ash's anxiety was blinding her to the guy that was actively trying to befriend her at that very moment. Still getting nothing back, Marshall just started talking. And again, Ash could see that momentary plea in his eyes. He rambled about everything, ranging from the weather, his general lack of interest in sports, the rum rebellion. But it wasn't until he made a passing remark about a video game that Ash perked up again. I like Doom too, she said lowly. Right? Marshall finally had something to latch onto, and he sure as shit was grabbing onto that like a life jacket. I played the shit out of that in school. Damn, 1993. Fuck, I feel like an old man now. Do you play much? Maybe a bit of Quake on the down low? Ash's face lit up just a little, starting to recognize the mutual interest that was developing. I like RPGs mostly, you know, like Daggerfall and the like. Anything where she could pretend to be someone else. Ugh, man, I wish I had the patience for those. What can I say? I just love me some ultraviolence. Ash giggled, and Marshall chuckled as well. She felt the whisper of a warmth in her chest. A sliver of happiness was just what the doctor ordered after everything that had happened. But all this talk of video games made her think of Joey. And quickly the cold filled her again. She stood to leave. Hey, thanks for telling me about the name mix-up. I'll go talk to Mark when I get the chance. Marshall stood as well and half reached out. Whoa, hey! She stopped, waiting for a sentence that didn't come. Now Marshall was the one struggling to think of something to say. What are you doing for dinner? He blurted out finally. Excuse me? Marshall was starting to trip over his words. Look, I wasn't kidding. We barely ever get newcomers in this town. And I just need to talk to someone new. Let me pick your brain, or hell, just let me talk and you can just sit in silence. Either way, you get a free meal out of it. Ash shifted in place. It was weird to have someone so desperate to talk to her, of all people. She was far more used to being unseen. So being sought out was making her feel like a fish on a saxophone. But there was something about Marshall. Even through everything, Ash suspected that this guy really did need someone to talk to. And what were her plans for the evening? Go back to her rust bucket and count the rips in the upholstery? Who was she kidding? She'd already done that last night. 67, by the way. All right, she said tentatively. Part 2. She had chewed on the idea for most of the day, and now, even after she had arrived, she was still second-guessing herself. Damn, that hurts, she said. Ash rubbed the side of her neck and tried to rotate her shoulder with little success. It seemed as though sleeping inside of a car for weeks had left her body in a state of what she was sure scientists would refer to as munted. And it had been weeks. Ash wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She never blew Marshall off. She just wanted to wait a bit before hanging out. She'd often roll her eyes as she thought about how she acted. Annoyed? Maybe. She thought she was messing up what he had tried to teach her. She had been too cautious. She'd left it too late. Once again, Ashley had let her anxiety dominate and ruin what could have been a real... Ash bit her lower lip and figuratively waggled a finger at herself. Stop it. You're fine. Take a breath and get out of your own way. She breathed deep and slow. Ash had never really been the kind of person to go out. She was far more comfortable wrapped up in a blanket on the couch. But she knew that he would actually want her to go out and live her life every once in a while. But even with her relative lack of experience, she thought that Everson's didn't meet whatever standards a place that served food needed to meet in order to both pass health inspections and survive a strong wind. She shrugged. Who was she to judge? Maybe the cocktail scent of cigarettes and grog trodden into the carpet was nostalgic for some people. She saw the door on the far side of the pub open. It was Marshall. 6 p.m. on the dot. Just like they'd agreed. Of course, she'd been there since 5:45. She wasn't entirely sure how these things worked and was trying a bit too hard to preemptively stop the ship from sinking. He scanned the room, saw her, and walked over with a smile. Ash's internal voice started screaming. Shit. She hadn't thought about this. She didn't know how people did the people thing. Had she unknowingly agreed to a date? Oh, please don't be a date. Stupidly, she just assumed that a guy had asked her out to dinner for what? A plucky, purely platonic hangout sesh? Marshall sat down. Oh, crap, she muttered. God, I don't smell that bad, do I? What? No, I was just... And when you know? Marshall stared, unblinking. Yes, he said with complete confidence. Ash laughed into her hand, rubbing her face. God. What am I doing? I'm sorry. No, it's all good, Marshall assured. Really? Yeah. Strokes are common in people your age. We can finish up here and I'll drive you to the ER. Alright. So far, better than expected. Ash had time to prepare her brain for human interaction this time, so she was at least 70% sure she wasn't going to choke like the first time she'd met Marshall. There were long pauses and jokes that didn't quite land, but none of it felt awkward. It all just seemed to flow weirdly. Is this what friends do? Ash thought. She was still so new to this whole thing. She may not have noticed it herself, but Ash was gradually getting more open as the conversations continued. It is a fact of life that it is only when you are mid-chat will a waitress appear to take your order. So, cutting Marshall off mid-rant about Star Wars, a brown-haired woman popped up, notepad in hand. She looked at Ash. "What can I get you?" Just a bowl of chips and some sauce, please." "No worries," the lady replied. "Drinks?" Ash shook her head. "All right, I'll get that for you." The lady went to leave. Ash furrowed her brow. Wait, hold on, you didn't get what he wanted." The waitress stopped and looked from Ash to Marshall and back again. Marshall, now looking down and away from the two of them like a beaten dog. The waitress scoffed. "Yeah, I'll just get those chips for you, honey." She left. "What was that about?" Ash asked. Marshall returned to the one tactic he knew best. Humor. "Oh, she's just jealous that I got captain of the cheer squad and she didn't." He smiled weakly. Ash knew that look. She had seen it on her own face for years. She thought of Joey, and a small spark hit her in the chest. No, that's not fair. What are you going to eat? What? Want me to go talk to someone? What was she doing? Ash never acted like this. She was a hermit crab. Her shell was where she belonged. But this just seemed like something she had to do. Despite her internal voice screaming at her to return to the safety of the shell. Anger, unresolved especially, can be a powerful motivator. Marshall's practiced smile broke for a second, and he, with a low voice, reached out for Ash and said, "Really, it's fine. I've got food. Don't worry about it." He gestured to a small plastic box he had brought with him. A packed dinner. He had packed a dinner. The spark in Ash's chest turned into an explosion. She didn't know what the hell was going on in this town, but she was already sick of its people. She stood, wishing she had a handbag to grab for emphasis, then cringed at the idea of a handbag and changed her mind. "Get up, we're leaving." She was surprised by the assertive tone she had never heard come out of her mouth. Well, except for maybe once. "Ash, it's fine. Really, don't worry about it." "No, it's not. People don't just get to treat you like you're invisible." She was in the grips of something. No idea what. It was like being drunk. Inhibitions dropped away, and the things that she had drowned in second-guessing and insecurity just fell out of her mouth. Marshall froze, not entirely sure how to handle this situation. Was he thankful? He thought so. Okay, all right, we can leave." He stood up, and Ash grabbed him by the hand and marched out of the pub. One of the waitresses pointed to Ash and cackled to one of her friends. "Well, we know who his next victim is gonna be." To Ash's surprise and Marshall's horror, she found herself turning on the spot and winding up for a punch. Marshall frantically grabbed at her arm and led her outside. No, it's fine, she's fine, we're fine, it's all good, just leave it." They stood outside, and before Marshall could finish opening his mouth, Ash jumped in. "Where's your place?" What? I guess it's... She cut him off again. Near or far? Marshall swallowed his protests. Near. Ash, still coming down from her fury, just said, "Take me." Marshall was ashamed of his apartment, though he tried not to show it. It was the same dingy shoebox he had lived in since high school, but at least now it was cleaner and had more than just a few pieces of furniture. They got in the door, and Ash rested against a wall and rubbed her temples. Her episode passing, and an endless cloud of "oh fucks" filling her head once more. I'm sorry about that back there," she said. Marshall poured her a glass of water. No, it's all right. I wasn't expecting that, is all. Now sounding the nervous one. "I'm not normally like that, I promise. It's just..." She sipped her water and sat on the couch. It just feels like everything's falling apart lately. Something happened and... She stopped. She stared into the glass. "And that's why you're in Duskbowl?" Marshall asked. "You're the first new face here in a long-ass while. Trust me, I've been here long enough. I know." So then the question is, why? Ash stared into her glass. Everything coming back to her in a whirlwind. But still, she wanted so badly not to face it. "Sorry I ruined your date," she said finally. Marshall sat beside her, unsure of whether to pat her on the back or hug her shoulder. No, it's okay. I mean, I'm flattered, but this wasn't a date." Ash looked up from her glass and fell back into the couch as that small wave of relief hit her. Oh, thank God. You see, for a second there, noted, I just want a friend, a mate. Like I said, not many new people around here. Besides, I've already got a girlfriend. "Oh yeah? Where is she? I'd love to meet her." Marshall paused and shrugged weakly. "Oh, she's around." An awkward silence fell. "Look," Marshall started. "Heaven's is a shithole anyway. How about I order us some pizza and we just chill out and watch a DVD or something?" Ash was thankful for his understanding this. And Marshall was thankful for hers. That, or perhaps they were just projecting onto each other. "Anyway, I'll make the order and you look through the stack of movies over there." Ash nodded, and Marshall left to the kitchen where the landline was. She pulled herself up and knelt by Marshall's stack of movies. It was the exact opposite of impressive. Then she saw it. Die Hard. Her whole body twinged, and that bubbling pain filled her throat again. Her eyes welled, and she wanted to slap herself for getting so worked up over something so small. It was just a movie. No. It was a reminder. She was pathetic. This was pathetic. She should just grow up and move on. But how could she when she was the fucking monster? A cry, more like a wail, exploded from her mouth finally, and Marshall rushed back into the room to see her shaking and weeping on the floor. He dropped the phone and held her. Hey, are you okay? What's wrong?" She grabbed at his shirt and scream-cried into it. He could feel her damp, hot breath through the fabric. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. God, I'm so fucking sorry. For another hour, she cried. Marshall didn't force advice. He didn't ask any questions. He was just simply there for her. Part 3. The 22nd of September, 2004. Ash's ears ringed and burned. Groggily, but frantically, she clawed at the blindfold wrapped around her eyes. She had woken up, scared, confused, cold, and in darkness. She needed to see. She had to see. Finally, free of it, she looked around. She was lying down in an alley, cold, wet concrete hurting against her knees and elbows. Behind her, sirens blared. In a daze, she looked over her shoulder to see, across the road, Duskbowl FM, smoke bellowing out of its windows, and more police cars than she could count at the front. Shakily, she got to her feet, horrified and concerned for those inside. But then the thoughts like seeds came back. She reached around to make sure that she still had her backpack. I can't let them find me, she said. I can't let them find me. G'day guys, it's me, Harry, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to this episode. Duskbowl is, well, it's my passion project, and it just means so much to me that you support it. And if you'd like to support Duskbowl more, feel free to like, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Anything at all that you could give would mean the absolute world. Your support really does mean everything to me. And I just want to apologise if you can hear trains and cars in the background. I've recently moved, so the whole setup is different. For a lot of you, this is going to be the first time you've actually heard Duskbowl, because obviously you didn't have the biggest following in the start. There are the tapes that if people new coming in want to listen to, feel free. They will give you a lot of context, I feel. I want to thank Romnex so much. I feel like a lot of you will be coming from her channel. Without her, I don't think Duskbowl would be getting the traction that it's getting at the moment. It really does mean a lot that she helped me out, and she is amazing. Please, if you aren't a subscriber of hers, please go to subscribe to her. She's absolutely fantastic. She does amazing horror narrations, and it is a crime she doesn't have a larger following than she does. If you want more Duskbowl, we're going to be uploading fortnightly, and on top of that, on our Instagram page, we actually have like a BARG found footage type story that's going on that you can go and enjoy, which I'm sure you'll get quite a lot out of. So that's on our Instagram page, which will be linked in the description. I'd also like to start having Duskbowl artwork competitions. So if you guys have any fan art that you have of Duskbowl, send it through to the Duskbowl email address, and then the winner of that competition for that week or fortnight will then have their artwork platformed both on our YouTube channel and on our Instagram page. Ash was voiced by the amazing Caroline Fester, and the always absolutely fantastic music that Duskbowl just wouldn't have an identity without is by Samuel Burke, a longtime friend of mine, and please, please, please go follow some of his music. I'll be linking some of his bands down in the description. And lastly, if you want to have an Australian accent in any of your projects, I'm a voice actor myself, so if you want to have me on board, feel free to hit me up on my FIVERR, which I'll also be linking in the description.